The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the ornate iron gates. Among them stood Karen Mitchell, a 42-year-old marketing executive from Phoenix, Arizona, clutching her designer handbag and wearing an expression that suggested the world owed her something significant. Karen had arrived in London 3 days earlier for what she called a well-deserved vacation, though her husband Mark might have described it differently. After 20 years of marriage, he knew that Karen's idea of relaxation often involved making everyone around her as stressed as she felt. The trip had been her idea, booked impulsively after a particularly frustrating day at work where her suggestions for the quarterly marketing campaign had been politely dismissed. She had spent considerable money on this London experience, staying at a 5-star hotel in Mayfair and booking exclusive tours that promised authentic royal encounters. Karen expected nothing less than perfection, and, so far, London had been a series of disappointments. The weather was dreary, the food was bland, and the service everywhere seemed substandard compared to her expectations. Standing near the palace gates, Karen checked her expensive Swiss watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The changing of the guard ceremony was scheduled to begin at 11:30, and it was already 11:40. In her mind, this delay was unacceptable, especially considering how much she had paid for her premium viewing spot. The crowd around her consisted of families with excited children, elderly couples with guidebooks, and groups of international students snapping photos. Everyone seemed content to wait, chatting quietly and enjoying the atmosphere. Everyone except Karen. "This is ridiculous," she muttered loudly enough for nearby tourists to hear. "We paid good money to be here on time, and they can't even stick to their own schedule." Her voice carried a particular tone that Mark had learned to recognize over the years, the tone that meant trouble was brewing. It was the same voice she used with restaurant servers who brought the wrong order, with airline staff during delays, and with store managers when return policies didn't align with her expectations. A gentle elderly woman standing beside her smiled sympathetically. "Oh, dear, these ceremonies sometimes run a few minutes late. It's quite normal, really. The guards have to coordinate their movements perfectly." Karen turned toward the woman with a look of incredulity. "Normal? There's nothing normal about being late when people have traveled thousands of miles and paid hundreds of pounds for this experience. This is supposed to be professional." The elderly woman's smile faltered slightly, but she maintained her pleasant demeanor. "Well, I'm sure it will be worth the wait. I've seen this ceremony dozens of times, and it's always quite spectacular." "Dozens of times?" Karen's voice rose an octave. "Then, you should know better than anyone that punctuality matters. This is exactly what's wrong with customer service these days. No accountability." Other tourists began to notice the commotion. Parents pulled their children closer, and several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. The atmosphere that had been cheerful and anticipatory began to shift, tainted by Karen's growing agitation. Mark, who had been quietly studying his guidebook a few feet away, approached his wife with the weary expression of someone who had navigated these situations many times before. "Karen, honey, maybe we should just enjoy the wait. Look around. It's beautiful here. Don't you dare tell me to calm down," Karen snapped, though Mark hadn't used those words. "I'm tired of accepting mediocre service just because everyone else is willing to settle for less. Someone needs to hold these people accountable." At that moment, the palace gates opened with a ceremonial flourish, and 2 royal guards emerged in their iconic red tunics and tall black bearskin hats. The crowd immediately perked up, cameras came out, and excited murmurs spread through the gathering. The guards moved with precise, measured steps, their expressions stoic and professional beneath their formal headgear. Their movements were choreographed down to the second, each step deliberate and purposeful. They took their positions flanking the main entrance, standing at perfect attention with their rifles held in identical angles. For most of the crowd, this was the moment they had been waiting for. Children pointed excitedly, adults raised their phones and cameras, and the general mood lifted considerably. The slight delay was immediately forgotten as the spectacle unfolded before them. But Karen's frustration had reached a boiling point. Instead of being mollified by the arrival of the guards, she seemed even more determined to voice her displeasure. In her mind, the delay had been inexcusable, and someone needed to acknowledge the inconvenience she had suffered. She stepped forward from the crowd, approaching the ornate iron fence that separated tourists from the palace grounds. One of the royal guards, a young man named James Whitmore who had been serving for 3 years, stood approximately 10 feet away, maintaining his ceremonial position. "Excuse me," Karen called out in a voice that carried across the courtyard. "Excuse me, I need to speak to someone about your scheduling." Guard Whitmore, following protocol, maintained his position and stoic expression. Royal guards are trained to remain motionless and unresponsive during their ceremonial duties, a tradition that dates back centuries and is considered essential to the dignity of their role. Karen interpreted his lack of response as rudeness. "I'm talking to you," she said louder, her voice now drawing attention from tourists throughout the area. "The least you could do is acknowledge that you kept paying customers waiting." Still no response from the guard, whose training had prepared him for various distractions and disruptions. He stared straight ahead, his expression unchanged, embodying the discipline and professionalism expected of his position. The crowd began to gather around Karen, some recording with their phones, others simply watching in fascination and growing concern. A few tourists tried to quietly explain that the guards weren't supposed to interact with visitors, but Karen was beyond listening to reason. "This is exactly the kind of arrogance I'm talking about," she continued, her voice growing shriller. "You think you can just ignore paying customers because you wear a fancy uniform?" Mark approached his wife again, this time with genuine alarm in his voice. "Karen, please, everyone's watching. This isn't the time or place." "I don't care who's watching," Karen replied, her face flushed with anger. "Someone needs to teach these people basic respect and customer service. In America, this kind of behavior would never be tolerated." Several British tourists in the crowd exchanged glances at her comment about America, but most remained focused on the unfolding drama. The situation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for everyone present. Karen's frustration with the perceived slight began to escalate beyond rational response. In her mind, the guard's silence was the ultimate insult, a deliberate dismissal of her legitimate concerns. She had never been one to back down from confrontation, and the public setting seemed to fuel her determination rather than temper it. "Fine," she announced loudly. "If you won't acknowledge me with words, maybe this will get your attention." Before anyone could intervene, before Mark could grab her arm, before the other tourists could react, Karen did something that would change the trajectory of her London vacation in ways she never could have imagined. She reached through the iron fence and slapped guard James Whitmore across the face with enough force to knock his ceremonial bearskin hat askew. The sound of the slap echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. For a moment, time seemed frozen. The crowd gasped collectively, phones stopped recording, and even the pigeons seemed to pause their activities. Guard Whitmore, despite the shock and stinging pain across his cheek, maintained his position and composure with remarkable discipline. His training had prepared him for many things, but being physically assaulted by an American tourist was certainly not covered in the standard protocols. Karen stood there for a moment, her hand still extended through the fence, seemingly surprised by her own actions. The anger that had driven her to strike the guard was immediately replaced by a growing awareness that she might have made a terrible mistake. The crowd around her began to murmur and shift uncomfortably. Several people were still recording, and Karen suddenly realized that her moment of impulse might have consequences far beyond her immediate frustration. Mark's face had gone completely pale. "Oh God, Karen, what have you done?" Within seconds, additional security personnel appeared seemingly from nowhere. Palace security, local police officers, and what appeared to be plainclothes officials converged on the scene with swift efficiency. "Ma'am," said a stern-faced officer in a crisp British accent, "I need you to step away from the fence immediately." Karen finally seemed to grasp the gravity of what she had done. Her hand dropped to her side, and she looked around at the faces surrounding her, some shocked, some disapproving, some simply curious about what would happen next. I was just trying to get his attention," she stammered, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. "He was being rude by ignoring me." "Ma'am, you've just assaulted a royal guard on palace grounds," the officer explained with professional calm. "I'm afraid this is a very serious matter." The words "assaulted a royal guard" seemed to hit Karen like a physical blow. In her anger and frustration, she hadn't considered the legal implications of her actions. She had simply reacted as she might have to any perceived slight in her daily life, not recognizing that this situation was fundamentally different. "Assault?" she repeated weakly. "It was just a slap. I barely touched him." "Any unwanted physical contact constitutes assault under British law," the officer continued. "And, given the location and the victim's position, this is considered a particularly serious offense." Mark tried to step forward to support his wife, but Another officer gestured for him to maintain his distance. The situation was now under official control, and standard procedures would be followed regardless of the circumstances that led to this moment. Karen looked back at Guard Whitmore, who had straightened his hat and resumed his position as if nothing had happened. His professionalism in the face of her assault made her actions seem even more inexcusable. "Can't we just apologize and forget this happened?" Karen asked desperately. "I'm sure he's fine. I didn't hurt him." The officer's expression remained unchanged. "I'm afraid it's not that simple, ma'am. You'll need to come with us for questioning." As Karen was led away from the fence, the crowd of tourists continued to watch in stunned silence. Many of them had captured the entire incident on video, and some were already sharing the footage on social media platforms. The elderly woman who had tried to reassure Karen earlier shook her head sadly. "Such a shame," she murmured to her husband. "She seemed so upset about waiting just a few minutes." Mark followed at a distance as his wife was escorted through the crowd. He couldn't help but wonder how a simple delay in a ceremony had escalated to this point. He had seen Karen's temper flare many times over the years, but nothing had prepared him for this level of public confrontation and its consequences. As they moved away from the palace gates, Karen caught glimpses of tourists still recording her with their phones. The realization that her moment of anger would likely be viewed by thousands, possibly millions, of people online added another layer of horror to her situation. "This is going to ruin everything," she whispered to Mark as they walked. "My job, our reputation, everything." Mark wanted to comfort her, but he was still processing what he had witnessed. His wife, the woman he had married 20 years ago, had just physically assaulted a member of the Royal Guard in front of dozens of witnesses and cameras. The officer leading them seemed to sense Karen's growing panic. "Ma'am, you'll have an opportunity to explain your actions during the interview process. For now, I need you to remain calm and cooperate fully." As they approached the police vehicles parked discreetly near the palace grounds, Karen took one last look back at the ceremony continuing behind them. The other guard had maintained his position throughout the entire incident, and tourists were slowly returning their attention to the spectacle they had come to see. But for Karen Mitchell from Phoenix, Arizona, the real spectacle was just beginning. Her impulsive decision to slap a royal guard would set in motion a series of events that would test her character, her relationships, and her understanding of consequences in ways she never could have imagined. The police car door closed behind her with a decisive click, and as they drove away from Buckingham Palace, Karen realized that her London vacation had taken a turn that no travel insurance policy could possibly cover. The police station in Westminster was nothing like the sleek, modern facilities Karen had seen in American crime dramas. The building was old, with worn wooden floors and fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows across institutional green walls. As she was led through a maze of corridors, the reality of her situation began to sink in with crushing weight. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, was assigned to Karen's case. Collins had handled her fair share of tourist-related incidents over the years, but assaulting a royal guard was definitely not a common occurrence on her desk. "Mrs. Mitchell," Detective Collins began as they settled into a small interview room, "I need you to understand the seriousness of what happened today. You've been charged with assault against a serving member of Her Majesty's Guard on royal property." Karen sat across from the detective, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped a paper cup of weak tea that someone had kindly provided. The fluorescent light above buzzed intermittently, adding to the surreal atmosphere of the moment. "I honestly didn't think it would be such a big deal," Karen said quietly, her earlier bravado completely gone. "Back home, if someone ignores you when you're trying to talk to them, you might give them a little tap to get their attention. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone." Detective Collins made notes on a legal pad while studying Karen's face. "Mrs. Mitchell, can you walk me through what led up to this incident? Start from when you arrived at the palace this morning." Karen took a shaky breath and began to recount her version of events. She described her frustration with the delayed ceremony, her growing irritation with what she perceived as poor customer service, and her final decision to get the guard's attention through physical contact. "The thing you have to understand," Karen explained, becoming more animated as she talked, "is that I work in marketing. Customer service is everything in my industry. When people pay money for an experience, they expect professional treatment. That guard was being deliberately rude by ignoring me." Detective Collins raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Mitchell, were you aware that royal guards are not permitted to interact with tourists during their ceremonial duties?" Karen paused, the question catching her off guard. "No, nobody told me that." How was I supposed to know? It's actually mentioned in most tourist guidebooks and on the palace website, the detective replied gently. The guards maintain their positions as part of a centuries-old tradition. Their silence isn't rudeness, it's discipline. The realization hit Karen like a physical blow. She had attacked someone for following protocol, for doing exactly what he was supposed to do. The injustice she had felt so strongly just hours before now seemed completely misguided. "Oh no," she whispered, covering her face with her hands. "I thought he was just being arrogant. I didn't realize." Detective Collins observed Karen's genuine distress with professional sympathy. In her experience, most people who ended up in similar situations weren't malicious. They were simply uninformed and reactive. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask you about your general approach to conflict resolution. Have you had similar incidents in the past where you've used physical contact to express displeasure?" Karen's cheeks flushed red. The question forced her to confront patterns in her behavior that she had never really examined. "I suppose. I mean, I've always been someone who stands up for herself. If I think someone is treating me unfairly, I don't just let it slide. Can you give me some examples?" Karen thought back over recent months, and the memories weren't flattering. There was the incident at the restaurant where she had grabbed a waiter's arm when he tried to walk away during her complaint about her meal. The time at the department store when she had poked a sales associate in the shoulder to get her attention while she was helping another customer. The argument with her neighbor that had escalated to her pushing him during a dispute about property lines. "I guess there have been a few times," Karen admitted reluctantly. "But nothing serious. Just trying to make my point when people weren't listening." Detective Collins continued making notes. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm going to be honest with you. Based on the witness statements we've collected and the video footage from tourists' phones, this incident is going to receive significant public attention. The footage is already circulating on social media." Karen's stomach dropped. "Social media? How bad is it? Let me show you," Detective Collins said, pulling out a tablet. She navigated to Twitter and showed Karen the first of what would become dozens of videos of the incident. Karen watched herself on the small screen, seeing her actions from an outside perspective for the first time. The woman in the video looked entitled, aggressive, and completely out of control. The contrast between her behavior and the guard's professional composure was stark and unflattering. "This has been retweeted over 10,000 times in the past 3 hours, Detective Collins explained. The hashtag #KarenSlapsGuard is trending." Karen stared at the screen in horror. Comments below the video ranged from shock and disgust to mockery and outrage. Some users had already begun trying to identify her, sharing screenshots of her face with requests for personal information. "This is going to destroy my life," Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My job, my reputation, everything I've worked for. Mrs. Mitchell, I understand this is overwhelming, but we need to focus on the immediate legal situation. You're facing charges that could result in significant fines and possible jail time." The word jail hit Karen like a slap across the face. Jail? For one slap? That seems completely disproportionate. Assault is assault, regardless of how minor you believe the contact was, Detective Collins explained patiently. And when it occurs on royal property against a serving guard, the courts take it very seriously indeed. Outside the interview room, Mark sat on a hard plastic chair, scrolling through his own phone and watching his wife's public humiliation unfold across every social media platform. The videos were multiplying by the hour, each one shared with increasingly creative and unflattering captions. His phone buzzed with a call from Karen's sister in California. Word was already spreading back home. "Mark, what the hell happened?" Janet's voice was sharp with concern and confusion. "Someone just sent me a video of Karen hitting a soldier or something in London. Please tell me this is some kind of joke." Mark rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. "It's not a joke, Janet. Karen had a meltdown at Buckingham Palace and slapped one of the guards. She's being questioned by police right now." "Questioned by police? Oh my God, Mark, how bad is this going to get?" "I honestly don't know," Mark replied. "Everything happened so fast. One minute we were waiting for a ceremony to start, and the next minute my wife was assaulting a member of the Royal Guard." "This is so unlike Karen," Janet said, though both siblings knew that wasn't entirely true. Karen's explosive temper had been a family concern for years. Meanwhile, back in the interview room, Detective Collins was explaining the potential consequences of Karen's actions. "The Crown Prosecution Service will review your case and determine whether to proceed with formal charges. Given the high-profile nature of this incident and the clear video evidence, I believe they will almost certainly prosecute." Karen's hands were shaking more visibly now. What kind of punishment are we talking about? Assault charges can result in up to 6 months in prison and a fine of up to £5,000. However, given that you're a first-time offender and an American tourist, you might receive a suspended sentence and community service instead. Community service? In England? But we're supposed to fly home in 4 days. Mrs. Mitchell, if you're convicted, there will likely be restrictions on your travel until you've completed your sentence. You may need to extend your stay significantly. The implications were staggering. Karen began calculating the cost of extended hotel stays, missed work, and the professional consequences of being absent from her job for weeks or possibly months. Is there any way to make this go away? Karen asked desperately. What if I apologize publicly? What if I pay a fine immediately? Detective Collins shook her head. I'm afraid it doesn't work that way. Once charges are filed, the legal process must run its course. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Another officer entered and whispered something to Detective Collins, who nodded gravely. Mrs. Mitchell, I've just been informed that several news outlets are requesting interviews about this incident. The story is gaining international attention. Karen felt like the room was spinning. International attention? It was just one slap. Yes, but it was one slap that occurred at one of the world's most famous landmarks, against a symbol of British tradition, captured on video by dozens of witnesses. The story has everything news outlets love: conflict, tourism gone wrong, cultural clash, and social media virality. Outside the police station, news vans were already beginning to gather. Reporters who had caught wind of the story through social media were setting up cameras and preparing for what they sensed could be a significant international incident. Back in the interview room, Detective Collins continued her questioning. Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask about your state of mind today. Had you been drinking? Are you taking any medications that might affect your judgment? No, nothing like that, Karen replied. I was just frustrated and tired. We've been dealing with delays and disappointments since we got here, and I guess I just reached my breaking point. Can you tell me about these other disappointments? Karen began listing her complaints about the hotel service, the weather, the food, and various other aspects of her London experience that hadn't met her expectations. As she spoke, she began to realize how petty and entitled she sounded. Mrs. Mitchell, do you recognize that your expectations might have been unrealistic? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Karen had never seriously considered that her standards might be too high or that her approach to problem-solving might be fundamentally flawed. I just expect people to do their jobs properly, she said defensively. I don't think that's unreasonable. But hitting someone when they don't respond the way you want them to, do you think that's reasonable? Karen was quiet for a long moment. No, she finally admitted. No, that wasn't reasonable at all. It was the first time since the incident that Karen had acknowledged any real responsibility for her actions beyond the technical fact that she had struck the guard. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm going to recommend that you be released on your own recognizance until your court appearance, which will likely be scheduled within the next 2 weeks. However, your passport will be held, and you'll be required to check in with local authorities every few days. The detective slid a card across the table. This is the contact information for a solicitor who specializes in cases involving tourists. I strongly recommend that you retain legal counsel immediately. As the interview concluded, Karen felt completely overwhelmed by the cascade of consequences flowing from her moment of anger. A simple slap had become an international incident, a legal nightmare, and a personal crisis all at once. Detective Collins escorted Karen back to the waiting area, where Mark sat looking haggard and worried. When he saw his wife emerge from the interview room, he stood up with a mixture of relief and apprehension. How bad is it? He asked quietly. Bad, Karen replied, her voice hollow. Really, really bad. As they prepared to leave the police station, Detective Collins pulled Mark aside for a private word. Mr. Mitchell, your wife is going to need significant support over the coming weeks. This case will likely receive ongoing media attention, and the stress can be overwhelming for defendants who aren't used to public scrutiny. Mark nodded, though he wasn't sure he was prepared for what lay ahead either. There are also some practical matters you'll need to address. I'd recommend finding longer-term accommodation, as you may be in London for several weeks. And you'll want to limit social media activity and contact with journalists until after the legal proceedings are complete. As Mark and Karen walked out of the police station into the gray London afternoon, they were greeted by the sight of news cameras and reporters waiting on the sidewalk. Someone had leaked information about Karen's identity and location. Mrs. Mitchell called a reporter with a microphone. Do you have any comment about your assault on the Royal Guard? Karen instinctively covered her face with her hands and hurried toward the street, but there was nowhere to hide. The cameras followed their movement, capturing her obvious distress and adding another layer to a story that was growing larger by the hour. As they climbed into a taxi, Karen realized that her London nightmare was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The small hotel room that had seemed adequate for a 4-day vacation now felt like a prison cell. Karen sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her laptop screen in growing horror as the story of her assault on the Royal Guard spread across the internet like wildfire. The footage had been picked up by major news outlets within hours. CNN, BBC, Fox News, and dozens of international media organizations were running the story with headlines that made Karen cringe. American tourist assaults Royal Guard. Karen goes too far in London, and when tourism turns violent. Mark paced back and forth in the narrow space between the bed and the window, occasionally glancing at his own phone as it buzzed with calls from friends, family members, and reporters who had somehow obtained his number. "Honey, maybe you should stop reading the comments," Mark suggested gently, noticing Karen's increasingly pale complexion as she scrolled through social media responses. "I can't stop," Karen replied, her voice barely audible. "I need to see what people are saying about me." The comments were brutal. Thousands of people from around the world were expressing their outrage, disgust, and disbelief at her actions. Some were calling for her to be banned from the UK permanently. Others were making personal attacks about her appearance, her nationality, and her character. "Listen to this one," Karen said, reading from her screen. "This entitled American woman is exactly what's wrong with tourists. She should be locked up and never allowed to travel again." This has 47,000 likes. "Karen, please," Mark pleaded. "You're only making yourself feel worse." But Karen continued scrolling, compulsively reading each new comment and tweet as if she were picking at a wound. The psychological impact was devastating. She had gone from complete anonymity to international infamy in a matter of hours. Her phone rang, displaying her boss's name on the screen. Karen stared at it for several rings before reluctantly answering. "Hello, David," she said, trying to sound normal. "Karen, what the hell is going on?" David's voice was sharp and professional. "I've had 3 different reporters call the office asking about an employee who assaulted someone in London. Please tell me this isn't you in these videos that are all over the internet." Karen closed her eyes. "It's me, David. But I can explain." "Explain? You physically attacked someone on camera, and it's going viral worldwide. Our biggest client just called asking if this is the same Karen Mitchell who handles their account." The weight of professional consequences hit Karen like a physical blow. She had spent 15 years building her career, establishing relationships with clients, and creating a reputation in the marketing industry. "David, please, this was just a moment of poor judgment. It doesn't reflect on the company or my work performance." "Karen, you're the face of our customer service philosophy. How can I have someone representing our company who assaults people when they don't get their way?" The conversation continued for several more painful minutes, ending with Karen being placed on indefinite unpaid leave while the company's human resources department reviewed the situation. As she hung up the phone, Karen felt another piece of her life crumbling away. The job that had given her identity and financial security was now in jeopardy because of 30 seconds of poor decision-making. Mark had been listening to the conversation, and he approached his wife with genuine concern. "Maybe this is a sign that we need to reevaluate some things," he said carefully. "What do you mean?" Karen asked, though she had a sinking feeling she knew where this was heading. Mark sat down beside her on the bed, choosing his words carefully. "Karen, this isn't the first time your temper has gotten you into trouble. Remember the incident at Sarah's wedding when you confronted the caterer? Or last year when you got into that argument with our neighbor that almost resulted in assault charges?" Karen stiffened. "Those were completely different situations." "Were they?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a pattern of escalating behavior whenever you don't get your way." The suggestion that her actions represented a pattern rather than an isolated incident was deeply threatening to Karen's self-image. She had always viewed herself as someone who simply held high standards and wasn't afraid to demand proper treatment. "I'm not some kind of violent person," Karen said defensively. "I just don't tolerate disrespect." "But, honey, the guard wasn't disrespecting you. He was doing his job. And even if he had been rude, hitting someone is never an appropriate response." Before Karen could respond, her phone rang again. This time it was a number she didn't recognize with a UK country code. "Mrs. Mitchell? This is Jennifer Hayes from the Daily Mail." I'm calling to get your side of the story regarding this morning's incident at Buckingham Palace. Karen's heart sank. I don't want to make any comment. Mrs. Mitchell, the story is going to run with or without your input. Wouldn't you prefer to have your perspective included? Perhaps you could explain what led to your actions. The reporter's tone was friendly and seemingly sympathetic, but Karen had been warned by the detective to avoid media contact. I really can't talk to you right now, Karen said, ending the call quickly. Within minutes, her phone was ringing again with calls from other reporters. Word had clearly spread that they had found her contact information. Mark took the phone and turned it off. We need to get out of here, he said. If they have your phone number, they probably know which hotel we're staying at. They quickly packed their essential belongings and checked out of the hotel, explaining to the confused desk clerk that they had a family emergency. As they exited through the lobby, Karen noticed a woman with a camera watching them from the street. Don't look directly at her, Mark whispered. Just keep walking normally. They found refuge in a small bed-in, breakfast in a quieter part of London, paying cash and registering under Mark's name only. The elderly proprietor, Mrs. Pemberton, seemed blissfully unaware of the international incident that had made her new guests temporarily famous. Lovely to have American visitors, Mrs. Pemberton said cheerfully as she showed them to their room. Are you here for sightseeing? Something like that, Mark replied, while Karen remained silent. Once they were settled in their new accommodation, Karen attempted to call the solicitor whose card Detective Collins had given her. The receptionist informed her that Mr. Richardson could see her the following morning, but warned that his schedule was full due to the high-profile nature of her case. That evening, as they sat in a small pub trying to blend in with the local crowd, Karen overheard other patrons discussing her story. Did you see that video of the American woman hitting the guard at the palace? One man was saying to his friend. Absolute disgrace that was. Typical tourist behavior, his companion replied. Think they can come here and act however they please. Someone should teach her some manners. Karen felt her face burning with embarrassment and shame. These people were talking about her as if she were some kind of criminal, and the worst part was that she was beginning to wonder if they were right. When they returned to their room, Karen found that the story had evolved throughout the day. News outlets were now running background pieces about her life, including information about her job, her hometown, and even details about her previous confrontations that someone had apparently leaked to the press. How did they get all this information? Karen asked in disbelief. This is supposed to be private. Nothing is private anymore once you become a news story, Mark replied grimly. People who know you are probably selling information to reporters. The violation of privacy added another layer of distress to an already overwhelming situation. Karen realized that she had not only lost control of the immediate consequences of her actions, but also of her entire personal narrative. Late that night, as Mark slept beside her, Karen lay awake staring at the ceiling and replaying the events of the morning over and over in her mind. She tried to identify the exact moment when everything had gone wrong, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the problem went deeper than a single moment of poor judgment. Her phone, which she had reluctantly turned back on to check for messages from the solicitor, showed dozens of missed calls and hundreds of social media notifications. Against her better judgment, she opened Twitter to see if the story was finally dying down. Instead, she found that it was growing larger. The incident had sparked broader conversations about American tourist behavior, cultural sensitivity, and the treatment of service workers worldwide. Op-ed writers were using her actions as a launching point for discussions about entitlement, privilege, and social accountability. I've become a symbol, Karen whispered to herself in the darkness. A symbol of everything people hate about entitled tourists. The realization was crushing. She had always thought of herself as a reasonable person who simply expected good service and fair treatment. But, seeing her actions through the eyes of the world, she began to understand how her behavior might appear to others. The next morning brought a meeting with Solicitor James Richardson, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s who specialized in representing tourists facing legal difficulties in the UK. Mrs. Mitchell, Mr. Richardson began, reviewing the file that had been prepared overnight. I need to be frank with you about the seriousness of your situation. The Crown Prosecution Service has decided to proceed with formal charges of assault. Karen felt her stomach drop. What does that mean exactly? It means you will appear before a magistrate's court within the next week for an initial hearing. Given the video evidence and multiple witness statements, the prosecution has a very strong case against you. But it was just a slap, Karen protested weakly. Mrs. Mitchell, The degree of force is less important than the fact that unwanted contact occurred. Under British law, any intentional touching without consent constitutes assault. Mr. Richardson explained the likely progression of the case, the potential sentences she might face, and the immediate restrictions that would be placed on her movement while the legal proceedings continued. How long might this take? Karen asked. Several weeks at minimum, possibly longer if you decide to contest the charges. However, I should mention that given the clear video evidence, contesting the assault charge would likely be futile and would only extend the proceedings. So my best option is to plead guilty? That's a decision you'll need to make. But, yes, a guilty plea would likely result in a more lenient sentence and a faster resolution. As Karen left the solicitor's office, she felt the weight of her situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. She was trapped in a foreign country, facing criminal charges, under intense media scrutiny, and dealing with the collapse of multiple aspects of her life. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the growing recognition that the woman she saw in those viral videos, angry, entitled, and violent, might be closer to her true nature than she had ever wanted to admit. The question that haunted her as she walked through the London streets was not just how to get through this crisis, but who she really was and whether she could find a way to become someone better. The Magistrates' Court in Westminster was a solemn building that spoke of centuries of British justice. As Karen walked through its ancient corridors accompanied by her solicitor, she felt the weight of history and tradition pressing down upon her. This was where countless individuals had faced the consequences of their actions, and now it was her turn. The media presence outside the courthouse had been overwhelming. Photographers and news crews from around the world had gathered to capture images of the American tourist who had dared to strike a royal guard. Karen had been forced to cover her face with a scarf and move quickly through the crowd, guided by Mr. Richardson and courthouse security. Inside the courtroom, Karen took her place in the defendant's dock, a position she never could have imagined occupying just a week earlier. The magistrate, a stern-looking woman in her late 50s wearing the traditional wig and robes, reviewed the case file with careful attention to detail. Mrs. Karen Elizabeth Mitchell, the magistrate began, her voice carrying the authority of the British legal system. You stand charged with assault under Section 39 of the Criminal Justice Act 1988. How do you plead? Karen looked at her solicitor, who nodded encouragingly. They had discussed this moment extensively over the past several days, weighing the options and consequences of each possible response. Guilty, Your Honor, Karen said quietly, her voice barely audible in the formal courtroom setting. The words seemed to echo in the silence that followed. With that single admission, Karen officially acknowledged her criminal responsibility for the incident that had turned her life upside down. The prosecution barrister, a sharp-featured man named Charles Thornfield, rose to present the Crown's case. Despite Karen's guilty plea, the court still needed to hear the facts of the case to determine an appropriate sentence. Your Honor, Barrister Thornfield began, this case represents a serious breach of public order and an assault upon a serving member of Her Majesty's Guard while performing ceremonial duties. The defendant's actions were witnessed by dozens of tourists, captured on multiple video recordings, and have brought negative attention to one of Britain's most cherished institutions. He proceeded to describe the incident in clinical detail, playing the viral video for the court and reading statements from witnesses who had been present at Buckingham Palace that morning. The victim, Guard James Whitmore, was simply performing his prescribed duties when the defendant approached him in an aggressive manner, demanded his attention, and ultimately struck him across the face with sufficient force to dislodge his ceremonial headgear. Karen listened to the prosecution's description of her actions with growing shame. Hearing the incident described in legal terms, stripped of emotion and context, made her behavior seem even more inexcusable than she had previously understood. Guard Whitmore has served with distinction for 3 years, the prosecutor continued. He maintained his composure and professionalism throughout this unprovoked attack, demonstrating the discipline and training that makes the Royal Guard an internationally respected symbol of British tradition. When it came time for the defense to present their case, Mr. Richardson stood to address the court with careful dignity. Your Honor, my client wishes to express her sincere remorse for her actions on that morning. Mrs. Mitchell is a first-time offender who made a serious error in judgment during what was meant to be a pleasant holiday with her husband. He went on to describe Karen's personal circumstances, her clean criminal record, and the significant consequences she had already faced as a result of the incident. Mrs. Mitchell has lost her employment, suffered severe damage to her reputation, and has been subjected to international public humiliation. She understands that her actions were wrong, and she is prepared to accept whatever punishment the court deems appropriate. The magistrate listened carefully to both presentations, occasionally making notes and asking clarifying questions about the circumstances surrounding the assault. Mrs. Mitchell, the magistrate said finally, addressing Karen directly, I want to hear from you personally. Can you explain what led to your actions that morning? Karen stood slowly, her hands trembling as she prepared to speak publicly about the incident for the first time. Your Honor, she began, her voice stronger than she had expected, I have no excuse for what I did. I was frustrated and angry, but that doesn't justify hitting anyone, especially someone who was simply doing their job. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. I realize now that Guard Whitmore was following proper protocol by not responding to me. I misunderstood his professionalism for rudeness, and I reacted in a way that was completely inappropriate and wrong. The magistrate nodded, encouraging her to continue. I've spent the past week thinking about why I acted the way I did, and I've come to understand that this incident wasn't really about a delayed ceremony or poor customer service. It was about my own inability to handle frustration in a mature and appropriate way. Karen's voice began to crack with emotion as she continued her statement. I'm deeply sorry to Guard Whitmore for assaulting him. I'm sorry to the other tourists whose experience was disrupted by my behavior. And I'm sorry to the people of Britain for showing such disrespect to one of your important traditions. The courtroom remained silent as Karen sat back down, her public admission of guilt and remorse hanging in the air. The magistrate took several minutes to review her notes and consider the appropriate sentence. The courtroom waited in tense silence while she deliberated. Mrs. Mitchell, she finally said, assault is a serious crime, regardless of the circumstances that led to it. Your actions have brought negative attention to a cherished British institution and caused distress to multiple individuals. Karen held her breath, preparing for the worst possible outcome. However, I also recognize that you have shown genuine remorse, pleaded guilty at the earliest opportunity, and have no previous criminal history. You have also already suffered significant personal and professional consequences as a result of this incident. The magistrate paused before delivering her sentence. I hereby sentence you to a conditional discharge for a period of 12 months, along with a fine of £1,000 and an order to pay compensation of £500 to the victim. Karen felt a wave of relief wash over her. A conditional discharge meant that she would have no criminal penalty as long as she committed no further offenses within the 12-month period. Additionally, the magistrate continued, you will complete 40 hours of community service to be performed at a charitable organization here in London before you are permitted to return to the United States. The community service requirement meant that Karen would need to remain in London for several additional weeks, but it was a much lighter sentence than she had feared. As the court session concluded, Karen felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief at avoiding jail time was tempered by the reality that her legal troubles were far from over. The conditional discharge and community service were just the beginning of a longer process of accountability and, hopefully, personal growth. Outside the courthouse, the media circus was waiting. Reporters shouted questions as Karen and her legal team made their way to a waiting car. Mrs. Mitchell, how do you feel about your sentence? Do you plan to apologize personally to the guard you assaulted? What message do you have for other American tourists? Karen had prepared a brief statement with her solicitor's help. I accept the court's decision and I'm grateful for the opportunity to make amends through community service, she said, reading from a prepared text. I deeply regret my actions and hope that others can learn from my mistake. The statement was brief and carefully worded to avoid saying anything that might complicate her legal situation, but it marked the first time Karen had spoken publicly about the incident since it occurred. Back at their bed and breakfast, Karen and Mark began the process of adjusting to their extended stay in London. The financial implications were significant: additional accommodation costs, legal fees, and the loss of Karen's income created immediate pressure on their household budget. We'll figure it out, Mark said, trying to be supportive despite his own stress about the situation. The important thing is that you're not going to jail. Karen nodded, though she was struggling with a deeper issue than the practical consequences of her sentence. Mark, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. What is it? Do you think I'm a bad person? I mean, really, deep down, do you think there's something fundamentally wrong with me? Mark was quiet for a long moment, considering his response carefully. I think you're someone who has gotten into the habit of reacting to frustration with anger instead of patience. But, no, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're someone who needs to learn better ways of handling difficult situations. But, this isn't the first time I've lost my temper and done something I regretted. Maybe this is just who I am. Karen, people can change if they want it badly enough. The question is whether you want to do the work to become different. That evening, as Karen researched the charitable organizations where she might complete her community service, she found herself thinking seriously about Mark's question. Did she want to change, or was she simply hoping to get through this crisis and return to her normal life? The community service coordinator she spoke with on the phone was surprisingly kind and understanding. We have several organizations that work with court-ordered service, the coordinator explained. There's a homeless shelter that needs help with meal preparation, a literacy program that works with immigrants, and a youth center that provides after-school programs for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Karen found herself drawn to the literacy program, perhaps because it seemed like a way to help people who, like her, might be struggling to navigate unfamiliar systems and expectations. The literacy program sounds interesting, she said. What would I be doing there? Mostly helping adult immigrants practice English conversation and understand British cultural norms. Many of our clients are dealing with the same kinds of challenges you might be experiencing as a visitor to our country, trying to understand how things work here and how to interact appropriately with British institutions. The irony wasn't lost on Karen. She would be helping other foreigners learn to navigate British culture while she herself was dealing with the consequences of her own cultural misunderstanding. I'd like to volunteer there, Karen said. When can I start? As she hung up the phone, Karen realized that for the first time since the incident at Buckingham Palace, she was looking forward to something. The opportunity to help others while completing her court-ordered service felt like a chance to turn her mistake into something constructive. But she also understood that 40 hours of community service wouldn't magically transform her into a different person. Real change would require sustained effort and honest self-examination that went far beyond the requirements of her legal sentence. The question that remained was whether she had the courage and commitment to undertake that deeper work, or whether she would simply serve her time and return to the same patterns that had led to this crisis in the first place. The East London Community Learning Centre was housed in a converted Victorian school building, its brick walls worn smooth by decades of weather and use. As Karen approached the entrance for her first day of community service, she felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach, though this time it was tinged with something unexpected: curiosity. Margaret Thompson, the program coordinator, was a woman in her early 60s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who had spent her career working with people in difficult circumstances. Mrs. Mitchell, Margaret said warmly as she greeted Karen at the reception desk, "Thank you for choosing to volunteer with our literacy program. I think you'll find the experience quite rewarding." Karen had expected judgment or suspicion from the staff, given the circumstances that brought her there. But Margaret's welcome was genuinely warm and professional. "I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to do," Karen admitted honestly. "I've never done anything like this before." "Don't worry, we'll start you off slowly. Today you'll be observing one of our conversation classes, and then, gradually you'll begin working one-on-one with individual learners." Margaret led Karen through a maze of classrooms where various programs were taking place. They passed a computer literacy class where elderly immigrants were learning to use email, a citizenship test preparation course, and a children's homework help session. "Our learners come from all over the world," Margaret explained as they walked. "Syria, Somalia, Poland, Bangladesh, people who have left everything behind to start new lives here. Many of them are highly educated professionals in their home countries, but they struggle with the language and cultural barriers." They entered a bright classroom where about 12 adults of various ages were seated in a circle, engaged in animated discussion with a volunteer instructor. The topic of the day was dealing with British bureaucracy. "Today we're discussing how to handle situations when you feel frustrated with government offices or public services," the instructor was explaining. "In Britain, there are certain expectations about how these interactions should proceed." Karen felt an uncomfortable jolt of recognition. The lesson seemed designed specifically for her situation. A woman named Amara, who appeared to be in her 40s, raised her hand. "In my country, if government worker is rude, you can speak loudly to get their attention. Here, this causes problems, yes?" "That's exactly right," the instructor replied. "In Britain, raising your voice or becoming aggressive usually makes the situation worse, not better. People respond better to polite persistence." A man named Ahmed nodded in understanding. So we must control our feelings, even when we are angry? It's not about controlling your feelings, the instructor clarified, but about expressing them in ways that will actually help you get what you need. Karen listened to the discussion with growing fascination. These people were grappling with the same fundamental challenge she had faced at Buckingham Palace: how to navigate cultural expectations when your instincts tell you to act differently. After the class, Margaret introduced Karen to several of the learners who would become her students over the coming weeks. "This is Mrs. Karen," Margaret said. "She'll be helping some of you practice your English conversation skills." Fatima, a young mother from Syria, smiled shyly. "You are very kind to help us," she said in careful English. "It is not easy to learn new ways." Karen felt a lump forming in her throat. "Actually, I think I'm the one who needs to learn new ways." Over the following days, Karen settled into a routine at the learning center. Each morning, she would work with individual learners on conversation practice, helping them navigate everything from job interviews to parent-teacher conferences to interactions with healthcare providers. The stories she heard were humbling. Ahmed had been a university professor in Iraq before fleeing violence that threatened his family. Amara was a trained nurse whose credentials weren't recognized in Britain, forcing her to start over in entry-level healthcare positions. Fatima was struggling to help her children succeed in British schools while learning the language herself. "Mrs. Karen," Ahmed said during one of their sessions, "may I ask why you volunteer here? You speak English perfectly already." Karen had been dreading this question, but she decided to answer honestly. "I'm here because I made a very bad mistake," she said. "I got angry at someone who was just doing their job, and I acted inappropriately. The court ordered me to do community service." Ahmed nodded thoughtfully. "Ah, you are learning too, like us." "Yes, I suppose I am." "What kind of mistake?" Fatima asked gently. Karen took a deep breath and told them about the incident at Buckingham Palace. She expected shock or judgment, but instead found understanding and even sympathy. "You were frustrated and acted from emotion," Ahmed said. "This happens to all people sometimes. The important thing is what you do after." Their lack of judgment was almost more difficult to bear than condemnation would have been. These people, who had faced genuine hardships and displacement, were showing her more compassion than she had shown the royal guard who had simply been doing his duty. As the weeks passed, Karen found herself genuinely invested in her students' progress. She celebrated when Ahmed successfully navigated a job interview, felt proud when Fatima confidently spoke with her children's teachers, and worried about Amara's struggles with credential recognition. More importantly, she began to recognize patterns in her own behavior that she had never examined before. "I think I understand now why I got so angry at the guard," she told Mark one evening as they sat in their temporary flat. "I've always believed that if I make my displeasure known loudly enough, people will fix whatever is wrong. But that only works in certain situations with certain people." Mark looked up from his book. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when I complain at restaurants or stores back home, it usually gets results because those workers are trained to accommodate customer complaints to avoid negative reviews. But the Royal Guard isn't a customer service representative. His job is specifically not to respond to people like me." "So you're saying you misread the situation?" "I'm saying I've been misreading situations for years. I've been treating every interaction like a customer service transaction where I can demand satisfaction. But that's not how the world actually works." This realization was both liberating and terrifying. If her approach to problem-solving was fundamentally flawed, what did that mean about all the other conflicts she had navigated throughout her life? As her community service neared completion, Karen faced a decision about what would happen next. The media attention had largely died down, her legal obligations were almost fulfilled, and she was free to return to the United States. But the woman preparing to leave London was fundamentally different from the one who had arrived 6 weeks earlier. "Margaret," Karen said during her final week at the Learning Center, "I want to ask you something. Do you think it would be possible for me to continue volunteering here occasionally? Not because I'm required to, but because I want to." Margaret smiled. "I think that would be wonderful, though I'm not sure how you'd manage it from Arizona." "Actually, Mark and I have been talking about that. His company has been wanting him to take a position in their London office for years. We'd always said no because I didn't want to leave my job and my life in Phoenix. And now I don't have a job in Phoenix, and I'm not sure the life I was living there was actually making me happy." That evening, Karen made a phone call she had been putting off for weeks. She dialed the number for Buckingham Palace and asked to speak with someone about contacting Guard James Whitmore. After being transferred several times and explaining her situation repeatedly, She was eventually connected with a palace administrator who listened to her request with professional courtesy. Mrs. Mitchell, while I appreciate your desire to apologize personally, I should inform you that Guard Whitmore has specifically requested that he not be contacted about this incident. He considers the matter closed and wishes to move forward without further attention to what occurred. Karen felt deflated, but also respected his decision. Could you at least tell him that I'm truly sorry? And that I've learned from what happened? I will certainly pass along your message. It wasn't the dramatic reconciliation that might have made a satisfying end to her story, but it was real and honest, two qualities that Karen was learning to value more than dramatic gestures. 6 months later, Karen was settling into her new life in London. Mark had accepted the transfer to his company's UK office, and they had found a small flat in a neighborhood that felt like home. Karen had found work with a marketing firm that specialized in helping international businesses understand British consumer culture, a position that drew directly on her hard-earned understanding of cultural differences. She continued volunteering at the Learning Center twice a week, and had developed genuine friendships with many of the people she had initially met as students. More importantly, she had learned to recognize and manage her own emotional responses before they escalated into destructive behavior. The incident at Buckingham Palace would always be part of her story. The video occasionally resurfaced on social media, usually accompanied by commentary about entitled tourist behavior. But Karen had made peace with being remembered for the worst moment of her life, because that moment had ultimately led to becoming a better version of herself. On a crisp London morning almost exactly 1 year after the incident, Karen found herself walking past Buckingham Palace on her way to work. She paused at the gates where it had all begun, watching tourists gather for the changing of the guard ceremony. A family with young children stood nearby, obviously American based on their accents and clothing. The father was expressing frustration about the delayed start time, his voice rising as he complained to his wife about poor organization and lack of respect for tourist time. Karen watched the scene with a mixture of recognition and concern. She could see herself in the man's growing agitation, could predict how the situation might escalate if someone didn't intervene. "Excuse me," she said gently, approaching the family. "Are you here for the ceremony?" "Yes, and it was supposed to start 10 minutes ago," the man replied curtly. This is exactly the kind of inefficiency that gives tourists a bad impression of London. "Actually," Karen said with a gentle smile, "the guards often need a few extra minutes to coordinate their movements. It's all part of maintaining the precision that makes the ceremony so special. And, honestly, the wait gives you more time to appreciate the incredible history of this place." The man's expression softened slightly. "I suppose you're right. It's just that we have a lot planned for today. I understand completely. But trust me when I say that the ceremony is worth waiting for. The guards take their duties very seriously, and what they do here represents centuries of tradition." As the family relaxed and began to enjoy the atmosphere, Karen felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had recognized a situation that could have escalated and helped defuse it before anyone got hurt or embarrassed. When the ceremony finally began and the guards took their positions with perfect precision, Karen found herself thinking about Guard Whitmore. She hoped he was doing well, hoped that her apology had been passed along, and hoped that he understood she had genuinely learned from their brief, unfortunate encounter. As she walked away from the palace and continued toward her office, Karen reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment. A single slap delivered in anger had cost her nearly everything she thought mattered: her job, her reputation, her sense of who she was. But in losing those things, she had found something more valuable: the ability to recognize her own flaws, the humility to learn from others, and the wisdom to understand that strength comes not from demanding respect, but from earning it through consistent, thoughtful behavior. The woman walking through London that morning was still Karen Mitchell from Phoenix, Arizona. But she was also someone entirely new. Someone who had learned that the most important battles are the ones you fight with yourself, and that sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover who you really want to be.